Hello, fifth graders. So today we are going to be answering our central question for social studies. Are Native Americans uncivilized? And the sub-question underneath our main question is, are all Native Americans the same? And this video is going to help you answer that question because remember, you have to write 5 sentences answering the question, are Native Americans uncivilized? And are all Native Americans the same? So let's get to our first picture. So in this picture, the title is Two Young Ladies Taken Prisoner by the Savages. Now, who are the savages? It seems like a lot of for most of the world, Native Americans were considered savages. When I went to college, I had people lump all Native Americans together, saying they liked to scalp people and they were just a bunch of savages. And it was truly heartbreaking because these were Christian people saying this kind of stuff. And that's not true, because the issue behind the statement, are Native Americans uncivilized, lies in the differences the two people groups had towards one another. In this picture, you have the Pilgrims and Samoset, one of the main leaders of I forget what tribe they were, but he was one of the ones who helped the Pilgrims when they came from Europe to the New World. And they're two total different people. You have the European colonizers wearing a lot of clothing. They have their long sleeve outfits, they have their long puffy pants and their little dainty shoes or whatever, and their pilgrim hats. And then you look over at the Native Americans and you see that they're not really dressed. They got their breechcloth clothing here. They have looks like a stick. They have their leggings and their feathery heads or whatever. Totally different people meeting together, and that's where the tension happened, guys. You have two different people and they don't understand one another. And the early colonizers did not make much of an effort to understand the Native Americans that were already in that region. They wanted what the Native Americans had, so they took it all over. Anyways, so you have this guy, the Pilgrim, saying, oh, this man is not civilized because look at him, he's half dressed. And you think to yourself, in that time period, Native Americans were living in a very hot area, especially these people, where the Pilgrims and Samoset met. That was in the woodland areas where it was very humid and hot. And why would these people be wearing all this clothing? And especially when they do a lot of hunting and a lot of gathering of food, and it's just not reasonable to be wearing all that clothes. So they wore their breechcloth clothing, their leggings, and maybe no shirt at all. But that was just how it was. That was normal. So, were Native Americans uncivilized? Let's take a deeper look into that. We're going to look specifically at your people groups and at your classmates' people groups. So Native Americans in what is now North America were strategic. In a world that appeared underdeveloped from an outsider's point of view, an outsider like European colonizers come into the New World to North America, the place looked like crud. They're like, this place is not good. They don't have the buildings we have. They're living in teepees and wigwams, and they're just not sophisticated, is what European Americans said. They wanted to change everything. So, from the outsider's point of view, coming into North America and seeing the Native Americans, they're like, this is trash. But the Native Americans were very much developed. They thought, we are developed. We got our homes, we got our lifestyle, we got our culture, we got it all figured out. We got our system of government. They knew who was in head. They had a head chief. They had clan systems. They were developed. So again, there's that tension. From the outsider's point of view, they're like, you don't look developed, you look like you're poor and you're dumb. But the Native Americans are like, nah, we got things under control. So they had their established routines, they had their established traditions, and a culture unique to their own people. They learned where to plant their crops and where not to. They learned which type of clothing was best to wear during certain seasons. They used the resources that were abundant in their region to create their homes. Native Americans were civilized because they built their homes, grew crops, and dressed themselves using only the resources around them, the resources that were given to them. Now here's a picture of a Pawnee warrior in 1867, and you see he's not wearing a top, but he's got clothing that was probably made from the resources that were abundant. So they have things like animal skin, deer skin. They use the deer skin to make their clothing. They use, I don't know what he used for his necklaces, but the wood that's abundant. He's got an axe here because he's a warrior, and he probably used the resources like the wood, and I don't know where he got this metal, or if it even is metal. It could be another wood, but they used that to make the stuff that they needed. And again, you have another picture here of, it's titled At the Indian Trade Post. It's dated 1925, and you have a wigwam. See, these Native Americans were creating homes that were made out of the resources. A wigwam was made out of, I forget, but it was made out of like the wood that was around the area. I believe some cloth too, but it was made out of the stuff that was abundant in that region. Okay, now let's start talking about the Native Americans in the Southwest region, which were the Zuni Indians. So let's make sure that you listen to this section, because you also need to answer the question, are all Native Americans the same? And listening to other information from other groups will help you answer that question. So let's talk about the Zunis. I don't know if I just reset it or whatever, but okay, we're going to start talking about the Southwest Native Americans, which are the Zuni, and make sure you're listening at this point so that you are able to answer the question, are all Native Americans the same? Okay, so here's a picture of a waffle garden of the Zuni Pueblo in New Mexico. So Southwest Native Americans, such as the Zuni, planted crops near the riverbed. So if you can see this here, I don't know exactly where it's at, but they usually planted their crops near or around water so that they can use the jugs to bring it back up to their waffle gardens. They made their waffle gardens so that it can store water, so that their crops had enough water to thrive. Furthermore, the Zunis use a natural resource that is abundant in their region, sand. So again, here's another picture of the waffle gardens that a lot of the Zunis made. You can see they made a lot of waffle gardens, and it was a very, very thriving kind of agricultural business. They were working really hard, and they got a lot of their plants done through that way. And here's a picture from 1911 where you see some Zuni women shaping the waffle gardens. And I don't know if that's a man over here who was just kind of sitting there doing nothing, but they were very agricultural. They were wise. They knew how to plant their gardens. And okay, so let's talk about their homes. So they made their homes out of what? Sand. Now, if you look outside our windows, there is a lot of sand outside. So the Zunis were thinkers, and they were civilized because they took what they had, sand and hay, and created beautiful and elaborate Pueblo-style homes. homes that almost look like modern day apartments. You see how these homes are stacked on top of one another? That's how apartments almost look. They're stacked on top of one another. Zunis were already thinking about apartments in 1903, in the 1800s. They were civilized because they were thinking about this stuff before early Europeans had started thinking about them. So in their homes, in a unit, which is about maybe like this here is a unit, or this whole thing would be a unit, lived one family or clan. These homes could be accessed by a ladder. You see some ladders going up this way. You see a ladder coming out and going up this way. So they were pretty advanced in their thinking of how to make homes. Let's see if I have another. Okay, now let's talk about their clothing. Women wore mantas and a sash tied around the waist. So here you see this is their manta, and it goes over one shoulder, and there's usually a sash right around their waist here. So they wore mantas and a sash that went around their waist. In the summer, men wore little clothing because of the heat. Underneath the mantas, women wore nothing. So you see, she's not really wearing anything underneath her manta. It's just her mantas covering her. However, when the missionaries came, they said that was inappropriate. So the Zuni women were forced to start wearing shifts under the mantas. So if we look at this one here, she is wearing something that is called a shift. Now that's what the people who write about Zunis call it, but it might be called something else in the Zuni tradition. But from before, they weren't wearing those shifts. And then in 1917, they started wearing it. So you see the difference in time periods, 1890 to 1897, no shifts. 1917, they started wearing a shift because the missionaries would said that it was really inappropriate for them to just be wearing the mantas and nothing underneath it, which is another indication that, you know, the two people groups didn't understand each other. They didn't understand the missionaries that came in, that, you know, it was hot, and wearing an extra piece of clothing like this is not that ideal for this time period. But, you know, the Zunis accommodated to their wishes and they put a shift under it. Men wore something known as a breechcloth. We all know how hot it gets in New Mexico. It would make sense that people wore little clothing in seasons such as summer, especially when they did not have air conditioner and fans. So a breechcloth is a really, it's kind of not much covering. It's just, I don't know if I have a picture of it in here. I don't, but I'll show you in the next slides. So women styled their hair in figure-8 buns called a chongo, and in this picture and in the picture before, her hair is styled cut short, and sometimes Zuni women would grow it long and style it in a bun in the back. However, the women and men wore their hair down. Now remember, these people lived in a hot area, so it was a civilized idea to wear your hair in a bun or shortcut. The main commodity that they had to eat was corn, squash, and beans. In today's time, many of us still eat corn, squash, and beans. We owe that resource to Pueblo people who grew those crops. Fun fact, actually. Zunis were never forced to leave their homes. They occupied the Zuni land for a long period of time. So the fact that we're still living in the area that we are is truly amazing, because the Spanish never forced us out. They let us stay here, and this has been our home for thousands upon thousands of years. Okay, and here's some pictures of some more pictures I found. So this is a Zuni water jar that some archaeologists have found, and you can see it's pretty dated and it's old. But I found this photo on botanica.com. That's where I found a lot of these photos. And then here's a Zuni potter making pot in 1903. You see how they're crafting it? They're coiling it with clay. That's pretty neat. Now we're going to talk about the Northwest Coastal Native Americans. Okay, now we are going to travel to the Northwest Coastal region of the Kwakuto. I don't really know how to say it well, so this is for the people who are Terrence and Derwin who are doing this people group. So first we're going to talk about where they live. So this is where the Northwest Coast region is. It goes up from the top of California, tip of California, it's out of the United States. It goes to Canada and Alaska. So this is where Terrence's and Duran's people are. Also the Inuit people who is in the movie Brother Bear. But the Kwajalein, if you look at this green little map here, they're found in this region, so just above the United States, but mostly in Canada. Now, the Northwest coastal Native Americans, such as the Kwajalein, were extremely lucky because food was abundant and easy to get to. However, they still created long, beautiful canoes that allowed them to fish with ease. So in this picture is titled in a language I don't know. It's dated 1881, and it's depicting a picture of the Kwajalein in the canoes they made. You see the carvings here? They were elaborate carvers. They did a lot of these totem poles, which you'll see in Terrence's and Duran's diorama. So they made these totem poles, and you see these log cabin homes. They made these huge homes, and these homes were made. They were made of rectangular cedar plank houses with bark roofs. So each house homed the clan or a family of about 50 people. So in these homes, about 50 people lived. So they spend a lot of time making these homes. Here's one. It's a picture in 1900s. I'm assuming it's maybe broken down, or maybe they're rebuilding it. But these are some of the Kwajalein homes in that region. And you see they live right next to the water. Now the one key thing you should note about the homes is that they made their homes from cedar bark. Now cedar bark is highly water resistant. That means if this water ever flooded here, see they live right by the water. If it ever flooded, their homes are like, you know how iPhone are sometimes waterproof, so they go down and they'll still live even if they got into water. That's what these homes were like. They were highly water resistant. If water got on them, it wouldn't damage it too bad. Okay, so I have some more pictures, but I'm going to pause real quick. I mean, you don't pause, but I'm going to pause this video real quick. Okay, so they made elaborate homes made out of cedar. But you know what else they made out of cedar? They made their clothes out of cedar. So you see here a skirt that is actually woven from tree barks. This is what some of the women wore. Now, is this exactly the way it looked? I'm not sure. This picture is not historically accurate. I have a title, but I don't have a date. And this is just an idea of what it might have looked like. Now here is a more historically accurate picture. In this picture you can see a girl, and she's part of the Kwajalein tribe, and it looks like she's wearing a sort of vest that is very rough, and her clothing is actually made from cedar. You can tell that it's made out of the wood stuff. So the women, like I said, that they used what they had to create clothing that was durable and usable. The men usually wore nothing but loincloth or breechcloth. However, in the winter they would wear long skirts and cloaks made of bark and deerskin, so their clothing adapted according to the seasons. If it was summer and hot, they wore little. If it was winter and cold, they wore layered clothing. Does that make them uncivilized? No, they were civilized because they wore clothing based on the seasons they were living in. Now this picture is not of the Kwajalein tribe, but it is part of the Taku tribe, which is part of the Northwest Coastal Region tribes. And in this picture you see the man is wearing a kind of a blanket outfit, and he's got the patterns that are very Quackaloto looking. Now this picture was taken in 1913, so that means this man probably had access to cloth and other material that you use in blankets. Now, knowing that when they had the extra resources like cloth and stuff, that kind of got loud. It makes sense that they made these elaborate kind of rugs now. Now, prior to this, they were wearing something called loincloths, and I'm going to show you a picture of a loincloth, or breechcloth is what it's called. Now, they usually wore breechcloth when it was cold, or well, not when it was cold, when it was really warm outside. So here you see a breechcloth. This is all that the men wore, I guess, in that time period. Maybe it looked like that. I don't know. Maybe it looked like that. Again, this might not be historically accurate because this man looks pretty American looking. So that's the breechcloth. And they also wore something like these leggings here. So there's a breechcloth in color, the leggings. And they wore these because, guys, it was hot sometimes, and they didn't have access to a lot of clothing. They didn't have sheep. They didn't have the buffalo. They just had cedar and maybe deer. And they used the deer skin to make their loincloth or the breechcloth and some of their clothing. So that is some of the stuff that the Quackaloto. Before I move on, let me say one thing. I don't think the Quackaloto was uncivilized. I think they were civilized because they wore clothing based on the seasons they were living. They created homes using cedar, a resource that was very abundant in their region, and they lived pretty comfortably. They lived right by a lake and everything, and there was a lot of resources for them at that point, and they didn't have to go hunting. They just had to go out in their long, pretty canoes and go fishing. So, yeah, I think they were pretty civilized for where they were at and the time period they were. Now, let us talk about the Great Plains Native Americans, the Lakota. So, let's find a picture of the Great Plains. This is where the Lakota lived, where they traveled with the buffalo. So here is a picture of the United States where the Lakota and other Great Plains Native Americans would kind of roam. Mostly in through Oklahoma and Texas and area stuff. This is where the Great Plains were. This is where the buffalo traveled. The plains people such as the Sioux depended on the buffalo. They were a flexible people who moved with the buffalo. Here's a picture of the buffalo. Because buffalo was their main source of living. Their homes are made from long poles and buffalo hides. So the homes that they made is the home that you saw Jocelyn and Traske make, a teepee. I'm going to do teepee historical. I spelled historical wrong. So here's a picture of a teepee in that time. You see there's a bandwagon and some dogs, so this probably isn't very historically accurate because in the period before colonization, they didn't have any wagons like this because they just traveled mainly on foot. This might be a better picture. So it says hide covered teepee. So the teepees were made from long poles like this that stick out from the top. They're tied together at the top, and they're kind of branched out at the bottom to form this kind of teepee. The poles, they created homes that were easy to take down and easy to set up. This helped them track and follow the buffalo. Now here's a fun fact. An entire tribe could take down their teepee in an hour, and they could also set up the teepee in about an hour. Can you believe how fast and efficient that is? Here's another picture of a teepee. Furthermore, because buffalo was very important to the Lakota, They ate a lot of buffalo. They would send hunting parties to hunt the buffalo. They made buffalo meat into jerky for later eating. Here's a Here is a picture of a buffalo. So they ate a lot of the buffalo, but you know what? They ate other things too. They did collect fruit and berries that were near or around their area. They were a conservative type of people. That means they respected the buffalo because it was their source of life. They only hunted what they needed. They never overhunted. They always used every part of the buffalo. It wasn't until the early European colonies came that buffaloes reached extinction. This is a sad picture, but when early European colonists came, they killed so many buffalo. You see this huge pile here? That is thousands upon thousands of buffaloes who died at the hands of early European colonizers. They were not conservatives. They just killed the buffalo. They didn't use all the buffalo. The Lakota used every single part of the buffalo. They used its heart. They did everything with the buffalo because of how they respected the buffalo. They wanted to make sure they never ran out of the buffalo. But when early European colonizers came, the buffaloes reached extinction. The white settlers overhunted and killed so much buffalo. They also did not use the whole buffalo, which is what I just said. Now let's talk about their clothing. The women wore dresses made of deerskin and were decorated with rabbit fur. The men wore leggings and buckskin shirts. So you can see this chief here. He is wearing some leggings almost, and the women were wearing dresses. Here's another picture of a Lakota outfit. Here's another. So here you see how he's wearing his leggings and his loincloth again. So the men wore leggings and buckskin shirts when it was cold. When it was cold, they would wear cloaks made from buffalo hides. The chief and warriors would wear headdresses. So let's go back to the chief picture. You see all these feathers around his head? That's called a headdress. So the chiefs wore these, but they did not wear it all the time. They only wore it every other day. The plains might have been a windy place with not much shade. Thinking about their clothing, they dressed in such a way because of the environment they lived in. Thinking about all of that the Lakota made and did, I will conclude that they were civilized. Another thing I would like to mention is that you see how they wear their hair? A lot of the Lakota wore their hair long, and they would braid it or they would just wear it long like that. Here's another picture of a Lakota. He's wearing that, I don't know what you would call this, but the fact that they used a resource like the buffalo to create clothing shows that Native Americans were not savages. They were using what they could to make clothing, homes, and food, and try to find food. Now let's talk about the Creek. The Creek are woodland Native Americans, and they are the tribe that Josiah and Tyshawn are studying. I'm getting kind of lazy now, guys, so I'm just kind of looking up pictures as I go. Okay, so these are Muskogee people, but the Creek are also known as Muskogee. So they have, when the Europeans came, they gave the Native American tribes names that they wanted to call them. So they called the Creek Native Americans the Creek, but really they like to be called, the actual Creek people like to be called Muskogee. So the Muskogee people were hunters and farmers. While the men hunted deer, the women would plant crops around the area they lived in. They were able to farm because they really didn't move around. They lived in homes they had two types of homes, and Josiah and Tyshawn know what they're called, but I'm going to find them. They lived in a mound grass home and a waffle and daub home. So here's a picture of what the Muskogee mound home might have looked like. Now, see, this is not historically accurate. Somebody made this one. Because you see over here, there's two people here. So, Muskogee didn't make this one. But here's another picture of a grass house. It's what they call it, a mound home. This is something that the Muskogee made. They also made something called a waffle and daub. Let's see if I can find a picture of that. Now here it is. Here's a drawing of it. This is it's not a waffle, it's a waddle. I'm sorry guys, it's a waddle and daub. Here's another one. That is not one. And here is another one of the waddle and daub. So the waddle and daub were made as permanent structures. First a frame was made from river cane and then mud was applied. It dried as hard as plaster and kept the family dry and warm inside. Now think about it, guys. How crazy smart were these Muskogee people that they thought, hey, let's do waddle and daub. So they took some river cane wood, they weaved it together, and they stuck clay on it so that when it dried, heat would stay inside the home and they would stay warm. These homes were ideal for this people group because they usually stayed in one region or area, unlike the Plains people who moved around. The Creek were the first Native American group who did daub homes, which is what I just said, waddle and daub. Now, this home is a highly durable home. The Creek were sophisticated because they crafted a home that would shelter them for long periods of time. It was sturdy because they invented the process of daub. Now let's talk about clothing. The men, like other Native Americans we just learned about, wore breechcloth and leggings. Do we remember what breechcloth was? If not, I'll show you another picture of breechcloth. There it is, the breechcloth. So they wore breechcloth and leggings. And these guys were woodland Native Americans. Now here's a cool thing. The Muskogee or the Creek styled their hair in mohawks, and they even had tattoos. So let's see if I can find a Muskogee. It looks like these pictures aren't that accurate. Now remember guys, when you're looking on the internet for clothing, for things, you have to be very careful not to get onto anything inappropriate. So we're looking for the Creek mohawk. See, the Creek Muskogee mohawk. Now I probably spelled Muskogee wrong. Alright, let's just find historical pictures of Alright, so here, this looks like a good one. So you see here, they have their little mohawks here. They styled their hair like this, I'm assuming for the fact that it's hot there and they don't want to have to worry about all that hair. And maybe they just thought it was cool too. But the men who went to war and who did all the hunting and stuff also tattooed themselves. The women wore wraparound skirts made of deerskin and woven fabric. Women wore their long hair in top knots. That means they just had buns on the top of their head. Now let me see if I can find a picture of a Muskogee or Creek woman. Now again, you have to make sure you find a historically accurate one. Now I don't know about this being historically accurate because it looks like it's found on Pinterest. See, that one's found on Pinterest too. Pinterest. This one might be accurate. It says it's a Native American wedding dress. Another Pinterest. That probably is not accurate. This one might be accurate. I don't know. But they wore a type of dress. They also both wore moccasins. Both men and women wore moccasins. The Pueblo Native Americans had long hair. The No, the Pueblo Native Americans did not have long hair. I made a mistake there. The Pueblo Native Americans either did their hair in buns or they had short hair. The Great Plains Native Americans and the Northwest Coastal Native Americans usually wore their hair long. The Creek men shortened their hair. Maybe in that region where it was hot and humid, long hair was not ideal. If the man had short hair, like a mohawk, they would not overheat. My point is, the Creek based their style of hair, clothing, on the seasons or the temperature. Now let's talk about the Navajo. Navajos were farmers, hunters, and gatherers. Men would leave their hogans, here is a picture of a hogan, would leave their hogans in search of venison, which is like deer, or other small game. Women would search their area for berries or other natural vegetation. They also farmed crops and sheep. Some crops that they farmed were squash, corn, and beans. The Navajo were civilized because they established a life in their region. The homes they created were hogans, which can be said to be a traditional earth home. Here's another picture of their hogans, the old-fashioned ones, I'm assuming is what they would be called. So these hogans were traditional earth homes. The Navajos were civilized because they used natural resources like sand and wood to create their homes. The hogan is shaped like a dome and packed with clay. The clay protects the people living inside from strong wind. Here's a fun fact. The door of a hogan always faces east so they can see the sunrise. So this picture, the door is facing east so that when the sun rises, they'd be able to see the sun. I don't know why, but that is a fun fact for you. Now let's talk about their clothing. Before they started raising sheep, they would make clothing from the yucca plant. Now let me show you what a yucca plant is, so you can see what they would make clothing out of. Here is the yucca plant. So Navajos made their clothing out of the yucca plant before they started getting sheep. Once they got sheep and goats and whatever, they would make what you see a lot of Navajos wearing now, which is those velvety looking kind of dresses. So the men wore, guess what it was? Breechcloth, and the women wore skirts. Shirts were not necessary in Navajo culture, but both men and women wore deerskin ponchos or cloaks of rabbit fur in cool weather and moccasins on their feet. Lastly, both men and women wore their hair in a figure-8 bun called a tissel. Tissel. I can't really say it in English or even in Navajo, so I'll see if I can find a picture of it. It is spelled T-S-I-Y-E-E-L. Okay, so here it is. Both men and women wore their hair in a figure-8 bun called a tissel. So what you see there, this looks supposed to look like a figure-8 bun. So they wore their hair like that. And let's see. Again, they also used resources that were abundant in the region. Yucca is a type of cacti, and the fact that they used that to make clothing is amazing. Can you imagine you making your own clothing out of yucca? That would be something. That shows a lot of skill and thought and creativity for someone to go and make something like that. All right, last tribe that we're going to talk about are the Algonquin. Now, Native Here we go, the Algonquin. The Algonquin were woodland Native Americans. They were traders. Algonquin people were traders. That means they would trade their resources with neighboring tribes such as the Iroquois. They depended on trading because they did little in terms of growing food. They also were hunters. Furthermore, they tended to grow squash and corn. Trading and being polite is a very civilized way to live. Therefore, I could safely say that the Algonquin were civilized. The men used bow and arrows for hunting. They also developed traps that would capture wild game. Furthermore, because of their innovative ways of hunting, I would say that the Algonquin were civilized. Now, here's a picture of them interacting with, I'm assuming, an early European person. Besides the traps that they made, Algonquins lived in something called wigwams. Here's a picture of a wigwam. They were dome-shaped and not very large because only one family lived in them. During the winter, the people would split up into hunting groups. Their homes would no longer be dome-shaped but cone-shaped. So maybe something like this. So when they left for the winter and some people went to become a part of the hunting camps, the rest would go off and make these little homes, these cone-shaped homes. And after the winter was over, they would discard them and return back to their wigwams. This is not a historical accurate photo because you see a person here. They would turn back to their wigwams. I lost my place. Now let's talk about clothing. The women wore long dresses with movable sleeves, very fashionable. The men wore, guess what again, breechcloth and leggings. However, sometimes they would wear a fur cloak around half of their body. Women would wear their hair long and in a braid. The men did their hair in an interesting way. Some would shave half the side of their hair, but would let the other side grow. They also would shave both sides, but let the middle grow out. Let's see if I can find a picture of the Algonquin Americans. This is probably the most famous. Well, he's not Algonquin, that's just the thing. I think it's really hard to find pictures of the Algonquin. This is a modern day version. I know this is not historically accurate, but this is something how they might have dressed. It's an interpretation of how they might have dressed.
Yeah.
I don't know about this one either. That looks kind of crazy. But this one here might be the best one we get to. And then this is the women outfit, the dress that they wore. Now, Native Americans had a way of life that was custom to their people and the environment. If they lived in warmer temperature areas, they wore little clothing. Why? It was normal. It was what was done. And I mean, would you wear heavy clothing if you had to hunt, fish, or grow crops in the summer? No. They made do with what they had in the area. They were wise. They did not kill more animals than necessary. They only hunted what they needed. They knew that if they killed too much of the animals, they would run out of food. This is a very civilized kind of thinking. Lastly, their homes were probably the most sophisticated creations that they made. They used the natural resources that were abundant in the area to create homes. I mean, how creative and useful were Native Americans? Native Americans were civilized because God blessed them with creativity and resources. God loved Native Americans, and what happened to them because of early colonization was sad. However, it was all necessary so that God could reveal himself to them. And that is the end of this video. I know it was 43 minutes long. You guys probably had to skip a couple of things and go straight to your section, but if you have time and if you finished your section, go back and pick another tribe and watch the video on it. And I know I stuttered a lot throughout the entire video, but you know, it is 8 o'clock right now and I'm a little bit tired and you guys may do with it. So I hope you learned something. If you want the paper for this, I actually wrote all the information down. You can come get it from me. All right. Have fun writing your 5 sentences.